A baby's cry echoed through the mansion, not the normal fussing of a newborn. This was the desperate wail of starvation. The most powerful crime lord in the region stood helpless, watching his son fade away. Money couldn't fix this. Power couldn't fix this. His empire meant nothing when his child was dying in front of him. The boy's mother had died during childbirth. Formula wasn't working, the baby rejected everything, his tiny body growing weaker by the hour. Doctors came and went with their recommendations, their expensive solutions, their clinical detachment. Nothing worked. The child was slipping away, and everyone in that house knew it. Then, the maid stepped forward, a woman who cleaned floors and washed dishes, who was invisible to most of the criminal organization that ran through that house. She just had a baby of her own weeks earlier. Without asking permission, without calculating the risk, she did something that would change everything. She offered to breastfeed the crime lord's dying son. What happened next didn't just save a child's life, it exposed the complicated humanity that exists even in the darkest places and created a bond that would challenge everything everyone thought they knew about loyalty, family, and power. This is that story. Before we dive deep into this incredible true story, hit that like button if you're ready for something that'll challenge your assumptions about good and evil. Subscribe because we're bringing you more stories that show the complexity of human nature. Share this with someone who appreciates stories about unexpected heroism. You won't want to miss a single moment of this one. Let's begin.
Let's be clear about who we're talking about. This wasn't some small-time street hustler or local gang member. This was a man who controlled entire neighborhoods, whose name was spoken in whispers, whose reach extended into police departments, government offices, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts for operations most people don't want to think about. His empire was built on the things that thrive in shadows: drugs, extortion, smuggling, violence when necessary. He'd climbed from nothing to become untouchable, not through luck, but through ruthlessness and intelligence. The kind of intelligence that knows when to use fear and when to use money, when to destroy enemies and when to make them allies. People who worked for him were loyal not out of love, but out of pragmatic calculation. Cross him and you disappeared. Serve him well and you prospered. It was a simple equation that kept his organization running smoothly while law enforcement struggled to build cases that would stick. Witnesses developed sudden amnesia, evidence vanished, prosecutors found themselves transferred to different cases. His mansion reflected his status, not ostentatious enough to draw unnecessary attention, but comfortable enough to remind everyone who visited that they were in the presence of power. High walls, security systems, people who watched and reported. It was a fortress disguised as a home, a headquarters disguised as domestic space. But here's what's important to understand. He wasn't a cartoon villain. He didn't wake up every morning plotting evil for its own sake. He saw himself as a businessman operating in a market society had deemed illegal. He provided services people wanted, employed people who needed work, and maintained order in communities where official authority had failed or abandoned them. He had a wife. They'd been together for years, partners in the truest sense. She knew what he did, understood the risks, accepted the reality of their life. When she got pregnant, it felt like validation, proof that even someone like him could have something normal, something pure, something untouched by the violence that paid for everything. The pregnancy was planned, celebrated quietly within their inner circle. He made preparations the way powerful men do, ensuring the best doctors, the finest prenatal care, a nursery that cost more than most people's homes. He was going to be a father, and he approached it with the same intensity he applied to everything else in his life. His organization watched this transformation with interest. A man with a family has vulnerabilities, but it also means he has more to protect, more reasons to maintain power, more motivation to eliminate threats. The baby represented continuity, legacy, the future of everything he'd built. In the months before the birth, he was almost happy as someone in his position could allow himself to be.
He'd survived wars with rival organizations, investigations by federal agencies, assassination attempts that should have killed him. He'd won, and now he was going to have a son to inherit everything he'd fought for. He had no way of knowing that birth would bring not celebration, but tragedy, that all his power would prove useless against the most basic human crisis, that his empire would mean nothing when faced with a dying newborn. The delivery was supposed to be routine. His wife was healthy, young enough that complications weren't expected, and they had the best obstetrician money could buy. The hospital room was private, secure, with his most trusted people stationed outside. Everything was under control, or so they thought. Labor started normally. Hours passed the way they do, painful but progressing, uncomfortable but manageable. The doctors seemed satisfied with how things were going. He stayed with her, held her hand, played the role of supportive husband because that's what the moment required. For once, his power was irrelevant. Biology doesn't care about criminal empires. Then something changed. The medical team's demeanor shifted from calm to concerned. Monitors started beeping with urgency. His wife's blood pressure was dropping, the baby's heart rate becoming erratic. Words like hemorrhage and fetal distress filled the room. Suddenly, there were more doctors, more nurses, more equipment being wheeled in. They made the call for emergency cesarean section. He was ushered out despite his protests, despite his status, despite everything. For the first time in years, he was powerless, standing in a hallway while strangers fought to save his wife and child behind closed doors. His security team stood with him, unsure what to do with a threat they couldn't intimidate or eliminate. The baby was born alive, a boy, small but breathing, crying with healthy lungs. For a moment, there was hope, but his wife was bleeding out on the table. The doctors worked frantically, transfusions, medications, emergency procedures. Nothing stopped the hemorrhage. Complications from the cesarean had triggered something unstoppable, and modern medicine was losing the battle. She died 47 minutes after delivering their son, bled to death despite every intervention, despite the best medical team available, despite all the money and power her husband possessed. In the end, she was just another woman experiencing a complication that kills thousands globally every year. Wealth provides no immunity to biology's cruel randomness. He held his son for the first time while his wife's body was being prepared in the next room. The baby was wrapped in blankets, impossibly small, unaware that his mother was gone. The nurses explained what needed to happen next: feeding schedules, formula preparation, monitoring for complications. Their words sounded distant, meaningless. His wife was dead, and he was holding a stranger who'd killed her. That thought was irrational, and he knew it, but grief doesn't follow logic. This baby, this tiny human who didn't ask to be born, had cost him the one person he'd truly loved, the one person who'd seen all of him, the violence, the ruthlessness, the criminal, and stayed anyway. She was gone, and in her place was this demanding, helpless creature, needing constant care. He returned to the mansion with a son, but without a wife. The household staff had prepared the nursery, but hadn't expected a funeral. His organization sent condolences through intermediaries, unsure how to respond to their leader's grief. And the baby cried endlessly, hungry, needing the one thing that had died with his mother.
Formula should have been simple. Scoop powder, add water, shake, feed. Thousands of babies survive on it every day. But this baby rejected it violently. He'd take the bottle, suck briefly, then spit it back up. Not normal infant spit-up, projectile vomiting that suggested something deeper was wrong. The pediatrician came to the house, examined the baby, checked vitals, asked questions about feeding patterns, suggested different formulas: hypoallergenic, soy-based, specialized blends for sensitive stomachs. Each one cost a fortune. None of them worked. The baby would scream, refuse the bottle, or vomit it back up within minutes. More specialists arrived. A pediatric gastroenterologist suggested reflux disease, prescribed medication that made no difference. A nutritionist recommended specific feeding positions, pacing techniques, temperature adjustments. Nothing changed. The baby was losing weight, becoming lethargic, showing signs of dehydration and malnutrition. The crime lord watched his son fade with a helplessness that enraged him.
In his world, problems had solutions. You threw money at them, applied pressure, eliminated obstacles. But you can't threaten a baby into eating. You can't bribe biology into cooperation. His entire empire was useless against an infant's failing digestive system. Nurses were hired for round-the-clock care. They tried everything: different bottles, different nipples, different formulas mixed in varying concentrations. They kept meticulous logs of every feeding attempt, every ounce consumed, every diaper change. The data painted a clear picture. The baby was starving despite constant intervention. By the end of the second week, the pediatrician was talking about hospitalization, IV nutrition, feeding tubes, intensive monitoring. The baby's weight had dropped below critical thresholds. His skin was taking on a grayish tone. His cries had weakened from loud demands to pitiful whimpers that broke something in everyone who heard them. The crime lord sat with his dying son at 3 a.m., holding this tiny person who was slipping away. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd caused deaths, ordered executions, destroyed lives without hesitation, and now he was being destroyed by his inability to feed an infant. Karma, maybe. The universe balancing scales in its own cruel way. His mother suggested a wet nurse. It was an old-fashioned solution, but desperate times warranted desperate measures. He made calls, put word out through his network. Finding someone willing to breastfeed a crime lord's child proved difficult. Women with milk either had their own babies to feed or wanted nothing to do with his world. One candidate came to the house. She took one look at the security, the armed men, the atmosphere of controlled violence, and left without even meeting the baby. Can't blame her. Wet nursing requires trust, intimacy, vulnerability. Hard to provide that in a criminal fortress. The baby's condition deteriorated further. His breathing became shallow. His body temperature was difficult to regulate. The pediatrician warned that without intervention, real intervention, hospital intervention, the child might not survive another week. That's when the maid spoke up. The woman who'd been cleaning rooms and washing dishes, who'd been present but invisible throughout this unfolding tragedy. She'd been listening, watching, and she had a solution nobody had considered. Her name was Maria, 32 years old, mother of 3 now, and desperately in need of work when the job at the mansion came available. She knew what kind of house it was. Everyone in the neighborhood knew. But jobs that paid well and didn't ask too many questions were scarce, and she had children to feed. When the crime lord's wife got pregnant, Maria cleaned the nursery as it was prepared, washed the expensive baby clothes, organized the overwhelming amount of supplies wealthy people accumulate. She remembered her own pregnancies. No designer nurseries, no teams of doctors, just neighborhood midwives and prayers that everything would work out. Her own third child had been born just 6 weeks before the crime lord's son, a daughter, healthy and strong, who nursed easily and slept reasonably well. Maria's husband worked construction when there was work, which wasn't often enough. Her older children were in school. She needed this job, needed the steady income, needed to not ask questions about the men with guns or the visitors who came at odd hours. When the crime lord's wife died, Maria felt genuine sorrow. She'd interacted with the woman occasionally, brief conversations while cleaning, polite acknowledgments in hallways. The wife had been kind to her, which was more than many wealthy employers bothered with. Her death felt wrong, wasteful, the kind of tragedy that shouldn't happen to people with every advantage. Maria watched the baby's decline with growing distress. She saw the specialists coming and going, heard the frustrated conversations, witnessed the crime lord's desperation. And she knew, from her own experience, from her mother's wisdom, from generations of women who'd faced this problem, what would save this child. But suggesting it was dangerous. She was staff. She was poor. She was beneath notice in the hierarchy of that household. Stepping forward meant drawing attention to herself in a place where invisibility was safer. It meant offering something intensely personal to people who could destroy her life on a whim. Her own baby was thriving. Maria produced more milk than her daughter needed. She'd always been fortunate that way. The excess was just wasted, leaked into nursing pads and discarded. Meanwhile, meters away, a baby was dying for lack of the exact thing she had in abundance. Her mother, watching her own children when she worked, told her to stay out of it. Not your problem, not your baby. These people are dangerous. Don't get involved more than necessary. It was sound advice, smart advice, the kind of counsel that keeps poor people alive in proximity to power. But Maria couldn't stop thinking about the baby's cries getting weaker, about the crime lord's devastated face when he held his dying son, about how simple the solution was if anyone would just set aside pride and class and all the social barriers that separated her world from his. On day 16, when the pediatrician was literally making arrangements for hospice care because the baby was clearly dying, Maria made a decision. She finished her cleaning duties, approached the crime lord's study, and knocked on the door. Her hands were shaking, her heart was pounding, but she knocked anyway.
He looked up from his desk, surprised. Staff didn't approach him directly. They went through intermediaries, through the household manager, through proper channels. Direct contact was unusual enough to be alarming. His hand moved instinctively toward the gun he kept in the desk drawer. "Sir," Maria began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I know how to save your son." The statement was bold enough to get his full attention. He'd heard plenty of claims from supposed experts over the past 2 weeks. None had delivered. Why would the Maid be any different? But desperation makes you listen to unlikely sources. "Explain," he said simply. Maria took a breath. "He needs breast milk, not formula. Real milk from a mother. I have a baby, 6 weeks old. I have milk. I can feed him." The words came out in a rush, like she needed to say them all before courage failed. The silence that followed was heavy. He stared at her, processing the offer and its implications. His son, nursed by the Maid. It violated every social boundary, every class distinction, every norm of their respective worlds. It was also the first solution that made biological sense. "You're offering to breastfeed my child," he stated, making sure he understood correctly. "Yes, sir. I know it's unusual, but babies sometimes reject formula. They need mother's milk. I have milk. Your son is dying. It's simple." She kept her eyes down, respectful, but her stance was firm. His mind calculated rapidly. The practical considerations: would it work? Was it safe? What were the alternatives? The social implications: what would his organization think? How would this look? Did it matter when his son was dying? The trust required. This woman would be intimately involved with his child, would have access and proximity that could be dangerous. "Why would you do this?" he asked, not accusatory, genuinely curious. "You know what I am. You know what happens in this house. Why offer to help me?" Maria finally looked up, met his eyes. "Because he's a baby. He didn't choose to be born here. He didn't do anything wrong, and he's dying for something my daughter has extra of. It doesn't seem right to let him die when I can help." It was the most honest answer anyone had given him in years. No angle, no manipulation, just straightforward human decency from someone who had every reason to hate him and everything he represented. The household manager had entered during the conversation, alarmed that Maria had breached protocol. He started to apologize to usher her out. The crime lord raised a hand, stopping him. "Get the pediatrician on the phone. I want to know if this can work medically. And if he says yes," he looked at Maria, "then yes, you'll feed my son. Name your price." Maria shook her head. "I don't want money. I just want the baby to live," which somehow made the offer even more valuable than anything money could buy. The pediatrician was skeptical but couldn't argue with the logic. Breast milk was demonstrably better than formula for digestion. Wet nursing was an ancient practice that had saved countless infants throughout history. If Maria was healthy, if her milk was tested and cleared, if proper hygiene protocols were followed, it could work. It was probably the baby's best chance. Medical tests were rushed. Maria submitted to blood work, health screenings, verification that she carried no diseases that could transfer through breast milk. Everything came back clean. Within 24 hours of her offer, she was cleared to nurse the crime lord's son. The first feeding happened in the nursery, with the pediatrician present and the crime lord watching from the doorway. Maria held the starving baby, positioned him the way she held her own daughter, and let him latch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his survival instincts kicked in, and he began to nurse. The room held its collective breath. Would he reject this too? Would he vomit it back up like all the formula? Seconds turned to minutes. The baby nursed steadily, eagerly, his tiny hands grasping at her as if afraid this source of food would disappear. He drank for 15 minutes before falling asleep, milk-drunk and satisfied in her arms. Everyone waited for the vomiting. It didn't come. An hour passed, 2 hours. The baby slept peacefully, his first real rest in days.
When he woke crying 3 hours later, Maria fed him again. This time he drank even more eagerly, his body remembering what it needed to survive. By the second day, the change was visible. Color returned to his skin, his cries strengthened, he started gaining back the weight he'd lost. The pediatrician was cautiously optimistic. If this continued, the baby would recover fully. Maria fell into a routine. She'd arrive at the mansion in the morning, nurse her own daughter first, then spend the day caring for the crime lord's son alongside her regular duties. She'd nurse him every 3 hours, sometimes more if he was fussy. At night, she'd pump milk that could be bottle-fed by the night nurses, though the baby always seemed to feed better directly from her. The intimacy of nursing created an unexpected bond. You can't feed a baby from your own body without developing feelings. Maria found herself worrying about him when she wasn't there, feeling relieved when he gained weight, celebrating his small developments. He wasn't just her employer's child anymore. He was becoming hers in a way that transcended employment. The household staff's attitude toward Maria shifted dramatically. She was no longer just the maid. She was the woman who saved the boss's son. That carried weight, commanded respect, created a protected status that changed everything about her position in that dangerous house.
Over the following months, the arrangement continued. The baby thrived, growing strong and healthy on Maria's milk. She nursed him alongside her own daughter, treating both babies with equal care and affection. The crime lord's son began to recognize her, would smile when she entered the room, would reach for her with tiny hands. The crime lord increased Maria's pay substantially, despite her initial refusal of payment. He also moved her family into better housing, nothing ostentatious, but safe, comfortable, in a neighborhood where her children could attend decent schools. It wasn't charity, it was payment for a debt he could never fully repay. Maria's status within the organization became unusual. She wasn't part of the criminal operation, but she was under absolute protection. Word went through the network. Anyone who threatened her or her family would answer to the boss directly. In a world where violence was common, she became untouchable. Her own children sometimes came to the mansion. The crime lord's son and Maria's daughter were milk siblings, a bond recognized in many cultures as significant. They played together as toddlers, unaware of the vastly different worlds they came from. For brief moments, the mansion felt almost like a normal home with normal children. But the dynamic was complicated. The crime lord was grateful, genuinely grateful, but also aware that his son's first attachment was to someone else, that Maria, not he, was the primary source of comfort and care. He was the father biologically, but she was the mother functionally. That created a tension neither addressed directly, but both felt. Maria's husband struggled with the situation. The money was life-changing, the security valuable, but his wife was nursing another man's child. She spent more time at the mansion than their own home. Their daughter was being raised alongside a crime lord's son. It wasn't dangerous exactly, they were protected, but it wasn't normal. Nothing about it was normal. As the baby approached his first birthday, weaning became inevitable. Maria's milk production would naturally decrease, and the boy was eating solid foods now. The intense dependency that had saved his life was ending, and with it, the unique bond that had formed. The transition was emotional. The last time Maria nursed him, she cried. He was moving on to the next phase of childhood, becoming independent from the person who'd literally kept him alive. The crime lord witnessed this goodbye, understanding on some level that his son was losing another mother figure, even if he'd never consciously known the first one. Maria continued working at the mansion, but in a different capacity. Less cleaning, more childcare. She became the boy's nanny, the person he trusted most, the stable maternal presence in a house filled with dangerous men and criminal enterprise. The crime lord accepted this arrangement because his son needed it and because he owed Maria more than employment could ever repay.
The relationship between them remained respectful but distant. She was staff, he was the boss, but they shared something profound. They'd both sacrificed for this child. Both put his needs above social conventions. Both loved him in their different ways. The boy grew up healthy and strong, unaware for years of the unusual circumstances of his early survival. He knew Maria as the woman who'd always been there, who'd cared for him, who felt like family even though she technically worked for his father. The truth of their connection came later, revealed gradually as he was old enough to understand. When he learned that Maria had breastfed him, saved his life when he was dying, his gratitude was profound. In a household where loyalty was purchased and enforced, here was someone who'd acted out of pure compassion. It shaped his understanding of human nature, taught him that goodness could exist even in dark places. The crime lord himself was changed by the experience. Not redeemed, he continued his criminal operations, remained dangerous and ruthless when necessary, but he'd been humbled by his powerlessness in the face of his son's crisis. He'd learned that money and violence couldn't solve everything, that sometimes salvation comes from unexpected sources, from people you'd normally never notice. Maria's life was transformed. The financial security meant her children received educations they never could have afforded. Her daughter and the crime lord's son remained close friends into adulthood, bound by their unusual shared history. Maria herself became a trusted figure within the household, her opinion valued, her position secure. But she never forgot the risk she'd taken. The moment she'd knocked on that study door could have ended very differently. She'd stepped forward not knowing if she would be rejected, punished, or ignored. She'd offered something intensely personal to someone who lived by violence. That courage, that willingness to act when others stayed silent, had saved a life. The story eventually became known within the organization, whispered among members, shared as an example of something. What exactly, people debated. Some saw it as proof that even criminals could recognize genuine kindness. Others saw it as showing that class and status meant nothing in the face of basic human need. A few saw it as Maria's clever strategy to secure her position. Maria herself rejected all these interpretations. "I did what any mother would do," she'd say when asked. "A baby was dying. I had milk. It was simple." The simplicity was the point. No grand moral calculation, no strategic thinking, just a woman seeing a suffering child and knowing she could help. Years later, when the crime lord was finally arrested and his empire dismantled, one of his conditions for cooperation was protection for Maria and her family. Even facing life in prison, he ensured that the woman who'd saved his son would never face retaliation from his enemies or prosecution for her proximity to his crimes. The boy himself, now grown, maintains a relationship with Maria that transcends their unusual history. She's not his mother, but she's not his mother either. She's the person who gave him life twice, once through her body's nourishment when he was dying, and again through her presence as he grew up in a world that could have hardened him completely. What does this story teach us? Maybe that humanity persists even in inhuman places, that compassion doesn't require permission or perfect circumstances, that sometimes the most profound acts of heroism come from ordinary people doing simple things that happen to save lives. Maria didn't storm a building or fight injustice or change systems. She just fed a hungry baby. And in doing so, she proved that even in a house built on violence and crime, even between people separated by every social barrier imaginable, human decency can still find a way.